Good day, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lilly with the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Energy Prices in the World Economy. We are grateful to James D. Hamilton for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website, www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our speaker. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our speaker, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated time at the end of the webinar to read and answer them. And now I would like to introduce you to James D. Hamilton, the Robert F. Engle Professor of Economics at the University of California at San Diego and co-editor for Quantitative Economics. Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I want to talk about recent developments in Russia and prospective current developments from the perspective of energy markets and the world economy. To remind you, Russia is a major source of the world's energy. Before the war, they were producing 13% of world field production of crude oil, and more than that, 17% of world production of natural gas. And I'll be talking about both oil and natural gas today, but I want to begin by emphasizing one very important difference between them. Crude oil is a fungible commodity, easily transported across borders, and to a first approximation, oil sells for the same price anywhere around the world. Whatever affects one part of the world in terms of oil markets is going to affect everybody else. Natural gas is a very different situation. Although it's possible to liquefy natural gas and ship it across the ocean, that's nowhere near the volume necessary to arbitrage prices across different communities. So when I say Russia produces 17% of the world production of natural gas, even more important, the local issue provides more than half of the natural gas that Germany had been using, again, before the conflict began. So I want to talk about both of those in detail. First, let me highlight this point I made about it's a world market for oil. Here's a comparison of the price of oil in the United States on the left, measured by the price of West Texas Intermediate crude oil in Oklahoma, and a measure of the European price, Brent crude, on the right. And there are some modest differences from time to time between these two prices, but as you'll see from the graph, essentially it's the same story. When oil price goes up one part of the world, it goes up everywhere else. So whatever Europe experiences in terms of oil prices, same is going to be true throughout the world. Now let me take that U.S. price and let's look at it in real terms. So take the price of crude oil divided by the U.S. Consumer Price Index. And the shaded areas in this graph correspond to U.S. recessions. And you'll see there were big run-ups in the price of oil in 1973-74 associated with the OPEC oil embargo. And later on in that decade with the Iranian Revolution and Iran-Iraq War, we'll be talking about both of those, and also a big run-up in the price of crude oil before the Great Recession of 2007-2008. And the increase since 2020 is on a par with those episodes. It's as dramatic an event as what we saw there. Now, I marked here the point at which Russia invaded Ukraine, and there was initially a big spike up in the price of oil in response to that. Subsequently, it's come down quite dramatically. And I want to talk first about that run up in oil prices that preceded the conflict. And second, talk about the factors that have been bringing oil prices back down since then. So first, why did the price of oil go up so much before Russia invaded Ukraine? It's a similar story to what we see in a lot of other sectors of the economy. There were big price increases a lot of places, and in general, and in oil in particular, that was because demand was recovering from the COVID lockdowns more quickly than supply. In the case of U.S. production, there was a big shakeout in the U.S. oil industry in response to those crazy low prices in April of 2020. That created a change in mindset of the guys that survived. It's much more a cash flow focused business today. What you invest, it comes from your own money to a larger extent. And that's meant that production has been much slower to come back than it came down very quickly, back up more slowly. And in fact, it's still a little bit below where it had been before COVID. It might well have recovered by the end of the year, but it was a very gradual response. Putting the pieces back together is still going on. And as I said, demand rebounded from the downturn much more quickly than production. A similar story in lots of other sectors. Now, as I said, that was all before Russia invaded Ukraine, and there was a big spike up initially, but it's subsequently down quite a bit. And part of the story there is this feature I mentioned, that it's a world market for oil. And here's a graphic that I found helpful from the Wall Street Journal. It's looking at how much oil Russia actually ships to other countries. Different colors correspond to different regions. And there was a big drop in shipments of oil to North America. The US stopped buying oil from Russia, and a big drop in, so that's in yellow here, and a big drop in European purchases, that's in turquoise. And initially that corresponded to a drop in total shipments. But subsequently, other buyers came into the picture. Russia started selling more to South Asia and Central Asia. And the result is that total production shipments as of a month ago were similar to what they'd been before the conflict started. And as I said, it's a world market for oil. It doesn't matter so much that the US is buying less. If somebody else buys more, it's not going to impact the price. Now, why though did the price come down? And here again, I think there's a broader story for what's going on, not really specific to oil markets. And to illustrate that, I've compared the price of crude oil here in black with the price of copper, that's in green. Copper tends to move similarly to the price of oil in response to broad changes in the economy. If you know what happened to the price of copper this week, you've got a fair guess what happened to the price of oil this week. Copper's come down along with oil, and I think that this reflects concerns about a slowing global economy. In particular, the lockdowns in China in response to ongoing fights with COVID there, I think are having a significant effect on China and will have a significant effect on the world. That's factoring in. There's the US monetary contraction we'll talk about, and elsewhere in the world, central banks raising their interest rates in order to bring down, and that's going to bring down demand for oil along with copper and everything else. So I think that's the basic story for what's been happening to the price of oil. Now, as I said, natural gas is very different. Here's a comparison of the price of natural gas in the United States on the left, measured by the Henry Hub price, and in Europe on the right. And you'll see these are quite different markets. There was a big spike in U.S. natural gas prices in connection with some heavy storms in Texas that produced some dislocations in a year ago. Not so much as a hiccup in Europe in natural gas prices in response to that. And then there's been a huge increase in natural gas prices in Europe since the war started. In fact, it's kind of hard to put these two graphs on the same scale. I show them where you could compare, but really the run up in natural gas prices in Europe is much bigger than in the United States. And that's because, as I say, natural gas shipments across the ocean are nowhere near enough to arbitrage those price differentials. Now, some new developments in natural gas this last week with the sabotage of both Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic Sea. Here's a map where you can see where those pipelines are and where the damage was. And that picture that a lot of us have seen of the natural gas bubbling up from the bottom of the sea and escaping into the atmosphere. So there's been an interesting dialogue, if I may say, between Europe and Russia as far as purchases of natural gas go, where Europe says, well, we'll show you we won't buy the gas. And Russia says, well, we'll show you we won't sell you the gas. And the issue is both Europe and Russia are going to be hurt by a decrease in natural gas. Europe because it's going to be hard to get it somewhere else, Russia because it's hard to sell it somewhere else. And although it seems like a strange move for Russia to sabotage this pipeline, it's a way of putting an exclamation point on no means no. I think there's another message that Putin was trying to send with this, which is if you look at other natural gas pipelines supplying Europe, I took this nice graph from a recent talk Volker Wieland gave on this topic. And for example, you'll notice that gray pipeline from Norway down to Germany. That's also an undersea pipeline. And the same procedure that disrupted Nord Stream could apply there, or other shipments out of Norway. And for that matter, shipments from Algeria to Southern Europe are vulnerable. And you don't have to stop there. The underseas IT cables are vulnerable to sabotage. Now, any such acts would be a clear escalation if Russia took out some pipelines from Norway. Of course, they would deny it. But escalation is the one card that Putin has, and he plays it again and again. Of course, this sabotage of the Nord Stream was an escalation. It may well mean that the rest of the world gets more serious about imposing sanctions, as this kind of activity has to frighten everybody, I think, not just the West. But there's certainly a potential there that the disruption of energy shipments to Europe could be even bigger than the very substantial disruption in supplies from Russia, per se. So that's a little background. We've not seen a big disruption so far in total crude oil production. We have seen a significant disruption in shipments of natural gas. I want to now ask, what are the potential implications of either of those developments? I take a further decrease in production of crude oil as a very real possible outcome here if, for example, sanctions become more effective and more universal. So I want to ask the question, what would be the consequences if a country or the whole world had to decrease energy consumption immediately by 10%? And I want to approach that question two ways. First, from the point of view of economic theory, and second, take a look at some empirical evidence. So starting with economic theory. So if an economist had to give a quick answer in 2 minutes, a reporter says, hey, we got a 10% decline, say, in oil production. What's going to happen to the economy? How big an effect will that have? One very simple way you might think of answering that question is, well, let's look at the dollar value of what we lose if we had to give up, say, 10% of our oil consumption. Now, oil itself is not a final product. It's used to make refined products like gasoline. And I'll be using US numbers here for illustration because I'm a little more familiar with what the numbers are and what they mean. So for the US, the dollar value of refined petroleum products is about 4% of US GDP. And so if you have a 10% reduction in that, and you wanted to ask what's the dollar value of what you've lost, you take 10% of 4%, that's 0.4%. So it'd be less than a 0.5% drop in GDP, according to this simple calculation, if you suddenly had to make do with significant, with a 10% decrease in the amount of oil you use. Now, of course, 0.5%, that's that would be something we notice, but just to put it in perspective, in an average US recession, the change in US real GDP between the peak, the business cycle peak, and the trough is relative to trend growth is about 5%. So 10 times as big. This would be 1/10 the size of a typical recession. So little disruption, but not that big a deal, according to this calculation. Now, as you know, there's also some solid economic theory for this instinct of saying, let's look at the dollar value to figure out how important it is. You can make a point either by looking at an individual firm or aggregate representations of the economy. Let's say Y represents the output, how much is produced by a particular firm. We think of that as being produced by some production function that depends on inputs of capital, labor, and energy. And if we ask what's the derivative of production with respect to energy, that is, we change energy use, but don't change capital, don't change labor, the marginal product of energy should, if the firm is in a competitive business, correspond to the relative price. Marginal product equals relative price. Relative price is the price of energy divided by the price of overall output. Now, if I take that equation, marginal product equals relative price, multiply both sides by the ratio of the quantity of energy we consume to the quantity of total output, multiply by E over Y. On the left side, I've got an elasticity. I've got an answer to this question we posed. If you have to have so much percent drop in energy use, what's the percentage drop in output? That's on the left side, that elasticity. And the right-hand side is the total dollar value of energy divided by the total dollar value of output. It's the expenditure share. And the nice thing about that right side is we can measure it. As I said, it's a number like about 4%. And so that simple calculation would justify that answer we gave, that a 10% decline in energy use might be associated with less than a 0.5% decline in output for any individual firm or for the economy as a whole. Now, here's a plot of what that expenditure share looks like. I've calculated a little different way because this is real easy to get monthly numbers on, but it's a similar kind of number. Here I'm looking at the total spending consumers do on energy, goods, and services as a fraction of total consumer spending. So that's the share as a percentage plotted here, and it's been declining over time. There's a downward trend in energy expenditures as a share of GDP. And so if this was your framework for answering the question, that the elasticity is given by a number like this, you'd say, well, the economy is more resilient in response to an energy disruption today than it used to be because the expenditure share is lower today. Now, that's true. There is a downward trend, but when you look at this graph, you realize it's not a straight line. It's not monotonic. This trend is interrupted by fairly dramatic increases back up in expenditure share. The expenditure share went back up in 73, 74 when the price went up. It went up in the late 70s when the price of oil went up, and it's gone up significantly in response to that run up in oil prices since 2020 that I commented on. And the reason is that the elasticity of demand for a product like oil is much less than 1. When an elasticity is less than 1, when the price goes up, your spending as a share of your total goes up on that good. And here you can see that relation pretty clearly. I plotted in the top panel that expenditure share, energy expenditure share in total consumer purchases. And in the bottom panel, the log of the real price of oil. And you can see very much the price of oil is a factor driving the expenditure share. And so then that raises one question. Well, when I'm doing this calculation, and I know that when we make do with less oil, the price is going to go up, which share do I use to value the oil? Do I value the oil for what we were paying for it back when it was cheap, or what we're paying now? Is going to be a bigger share now. Now, the driving factor here, I use general energy. That's going to include electricity. It's going to include natural gas. We can also do this calculation if we wanted to isolate it a little more particularly in terms of gasoline. So that blue line is the expenditure of US consumers on gasoline as a percent of their total consumer spending. And you can see that that's basically what's driving these ups and downs in the expenditure share overall. It's ups and downs in the fraction of household budgets that are going to gasoline. Now, we can get kind of quantitative about the relation between that blue line and what's happening to the price of gasoline. So let me let STG denote consumer purchases of gasoline as a share of total spending in month T. So STG is exactly the height of that blue line I just showed you. We've got data on that each month. And let's look at the overall CPI for the US. That's PT CPI. We've got data on that. And the consumer price index for gasoline. There's a separate consumer price index for gasoline. Now, suppose for illustration that the short run price elasticity of gasoline demand was 0. It's an extreme assumption. It would say that when the price goes up, people ignore the price change and they keep buying the same number of gallons of gasoline that they bought last month. They just spend more on gasoline. Of course, that means you have to cut back somewhere else if you're just spending more on gasoline. What would be the implication of that simple story? Well, that story would say you can predict what the expenditure share on gasoline is going to be this month by looking at what the expenditure share on gasoline was a year ago, ST minus 12, and multiplying it by the change in the relative price of gasoline over the last year. If gasoline price has doubled relative to other prices, that expenditure share would double if everybody's still buying the same amount of gasoline despite the price increase. So what I've done here is apply that prediction. So the black is the actual expenditure share of consumers in the US on gasoline. The blue is the predicted from that formula. So again, there's no regression here. There's no fit to data. I just literally took the share a year ago, multiplied it by the observed price change, and there's an amazing fit. In fact, it's an embarrassingly good fit. I'm inferring from that maybe BEA and BLS, who give us these numbers, do some imputing, do some estimation where they say, well, probably consumers are spending the same, buying the same number of gallons this month as before. I don't know, but it's a very simple-minded model, but it's a very close description. So to a first approximation, that's the way we should think about things, that American consumers, when the price of gasoline goes up, they keep buying it. They just try to cut back spending somewhere else. Now, let's go back to the production function perspective on this. So we've got some firms, say, producing output Y from inputs of energy, capital, and labor. Before I gave that production function using a general function, and what I said about elasticities is true for a general production function. Now let's specialize that to a particular production function, a particular functional form, so we can get numbers a little different way. This is a constant elasticity of substitution production function between energy, E, and an input of a composite input of capital and labor, where there's an elasticity of substitution, sigma. And so if you give me a function like this, I don't have to take a derivative, a first order approximation. I could calculate the actual change in Y as we decrease E, holding K and N constant. In other words, I could do a calculation that takes into account the fact that the expenditure share is going to change as we change the quantity of energy that we use. And you can see the importance of this, for example, taking an extreme case. This whole argument, well, the loss to GDP is just the dollar value of the oil using the old prices as a base. If you carry that argument to extreme, it would say, well, what would happen if we had 100% decline in our consumption of crude oil? And according to that newspaper kind of answer I gave, or according to that derivative of production function answer I gave, if there were 100% drop in oil availability, there'd be like a 4% drop in GDP. And obviously that's crazy. And it's crazy because there's, as we try to make do with less and less oil, it's going to become more and more valuable, and the dollar value of what we give up becomes greater. So here's a way that allows us to deal with that. And so we can take that production function and ask, okay, suppose there's a 10% drop in energy consumption. How much in percentage terms does output change? And let's answer that question for different values of this elasticity, different values of sigma. So the first order approximation, that's in blue. That's this idea we could just take the derivative and not worry about the share changing. That was that modest answer that's less than half of 1%. And by the way, I've taken this kind of graph from a recent paper by Rudy Bachman and a number of co-authors. And so even elasticity of substitution is very low, like 0.05. You get an answer that's not that different from the first order. There'd be some increase in expenditure share. It's not that big a deal. As the elasticity gets smaller, for example, 0.01, very, very low elasticity of substitution, then you start to see a more significant change. And in the extreme of Leontief, where you just cannot produce output without energy, 10% drop in energy would mean a 10% drop in output. Now, all of that was based on this simple one sector model or analysis of one firm. Mackay and Farhi have a paper where they develop calculations like this for a non-epsilon change, not derivatives, but the actual change, using a very detailed model of lots of different sectors, trying to estimate elasticities between them. And Bachmann, along with Bakai and a number of other co-authors, basically used that approach to take a look at the situation in Germany. And they conclude that a complete cutoff of energy imports from Russia would reduce German GDP by somewhere between 0.5% and 3%, depending on substitutability. And so, depending on how difficult it is to make these substitutions, it might be something, according to their worst case calculations, something almost as big as a typical recession, but not quite. And more probably, they think it wouldn't be that big. So there's one way to answer the question, or actually a series of answers. The kind of the quick answer, taking derivatives. More involved answer, looking in detail at sectoral linkages. And the answer is relatively optimistic that, yeah, it would be a disruption, but business could go on. That's one way you could answer this question. What would happen if there's, say, a 10% decline in oil production or a 10% decline in access to natural gas? Use the natural gas expenditure there. I want to now turn to empirical evidence. Do we have any historical precedents that we could use to ask what would happen if we had a 10% decline in oil production? And I think we do. I think there are a number of such precedents, and I briefly alluded to a few of them. For example, in 1973-74, the Arab members of OPEC announced an embargo that they would not sell oil to certain countries that they perceived to be sympathetic to the cause of Israel in the Arab-Israeli war. Now, as I said, it doesn't matter if they stop selling to the US, if they sell to somebody else. What matters is the total production. And so I plotted here, the horizontal axis is months following the Arab-Israeli war, and the vertical axis is the percent change in production in black from the OPEC countries as a percent of world production. So you can see that was roughly 7% decline in world production of crude oil for about 2 or 3 months, and then production started to increase. Now, in any of these episodes, we can ask, well, did the world find some other source of oil? There was a little bit. Iran increased their production a little bit in response to the OPEC embargo. So in blue is the total change, total observed change in world production of crude oil with this event. And the offset was relatively modest. So it was pretty much also a 7% decline in total production. The world had to get by for a short period of time with a substantially less use of crude oil. So that's one example. Another example came a few years later with the Iranian Revolution. Iran had been a major producer of crude oil. The revolution stopped that. And again, if you just look at Iranian production, it would have been about a 7% drop in world oil production. In this case, there were more significant offsets from other countries were able to increase their production, but still it was a significant drop in world production, at least for half a year or so. And there's several other episodes like this. Shortly after the Iranian Revolution, there was the Iran-Iraq War, which knocked out a lot more production. There was the first Gulf War in 1990. All of those were roughly disruptions of world supplies on the order of 5%, a little more. And every one of those 4 episodes was followed by an economic recession in the United States. And if you took seriously those kind of calculations we were talking about, you'd say, well, how could disruptions like this, just 5%, how could that be big enough to to lead to a recession. Now, there were other events, other shocks that were happening at the same time. Maybe oil was just a sideshow. But one of the points I would like to make is that economic recessions are characterized by underutilized resources. Almost a defining feature of a recession is that the unemployment rate spikes up. If the unemployment rate spikes up, that means you're not just using less energy, you're using less labor if the people aren't working. Capacity utilization declines in an economic recession, something we observe. We're utilizing less capital. And so that whole concept behind either the derivative, where we said, let's change energy, but not change labor or capital, or the more complicated calculations of Bachman et al., or just change energy, assume we can keep everybody working, we're kind of assuming that we didn't have a recession. Now, is there any reason to believe that the historical oil shocks, like the ones I just mentioned, might have been factors contributing to the spike up in unemployment and the reduction in capital utilization? Well, I think there are. One clear example in the case of the United States is the automobile sector. One of the things we saw happen in these historical episodes is that consumers stopped buying as many cars. In particular, they stopped buying the less fuel efficient cars that the US automakers had been specializing in. Imported car sales sometimes went up. But if American consumers are buying less American-made cars, the workers who had been building them are underemployed or unemployed. The factories that had been producing them are not going to run at full capacity. And this would be, if you like, a secondary consequence. It's not just that we're using less energy, it's that we're using our capital and labor less effectively, less efficiently than before because they're underemployed. And so, for example, with these 5 recessions here I've indicated, you can ask, suppose there had been nothing else happen other than the decline in US auto production over these periods, what would have been the effect on GDP? And you see that the answer is basically in the same ballpark as that back of the envelope calculation of making do with less energy alone. And so insofar as these events can lead to a disruption in spending on other goods and services, they have a potential for a much bigger effect. Another thing we see in the data is there seems to be a connection between consumer sentiment and oil prices. When people see the price of gasoline going up, as I say, most of them try to buy the same amount of gasoline as before. They have to cut back spending on something else. And so many households that spend much more than this average fraction on gasoline, and they get very upset. And so here, for example, on the top panel, I've showed you the real price of oil that we've looked at a couple of times. And the bottom panel is an index of consumer sentiment that comes from this Michigan survey. And you can see that when oil prices were going up in 73, in 78, I'm sorry, I don't have 73 on here, but I've got the 78. Yeah, this index starts in 78. You see that there was that big increase in price of oil in 78, big drop in consumer sentiment. Again, a run up in oil prices that started before the Great Recession, and sentiment started tanking before that. Recent big run up in oil prices, recent big drop in consumer sentiment. Consumer sentiment and business sentiment are kind of the quintessential Keynesian shock. If people become more pessimistic for whatever reason, however rational it is, and I think there is rationality, at least for some households here, that can be a major shock to the economy. So I think there is a very significant possibility that we don't want to just think about the dollar value of the oil. we want to think about the dollar changes in total spending, or the euro changes in total spending, and that these are potentially quite significant. And so I think the concern here is that it's not just trying to make do with less energy, it's trying to adapt to all the changes in spending that will result from the dislocations. Now, if it were the simple Keynesian story, the traditional textbook answer is, well, let's use expansionary monetary and fiscal policy, and that'll offset the shock. I think if you look at the situation in any country today, you realize, well, that textbook prescription is not too appropriate. How can we possibly use more expansionary monetary policy right now? We're worried about inflation. I'm going to talk about inflation in just a moment. Alternatively, there are other models, and I have a couple of papers, including a recent one, making this point, that there are physical costs. It's physically not feasible to relocate the specialized labor and capital that have been making less fuel efficient cars into doing something else. And insofar as those are physical factors, not nominal rigidities, there may be very limited potential for monetary or fiscal stimulus to offset this. So my view overall is that what's happened so far to energy prices probably contributed to the slowdown in economic growth. Actually, we saw a couple quarters of very slightly negative GDP in the US, but not enough to cause a recession in the US. I think the challenges facing Europe are more significant, could well mean a recession there. And coupled with other shocks, I mentioned the problems China is facing, I mentioned the monetary contraction, a global recession is quite possible. Now, I wanted to comment briefly also on inflation. So we can do a similar kind of calculation, similar kind of naive calculation, the one I criticized in GDP. We could ask, we could observe, well, prices tend to rise, they don't tend to fall. If prices of other goods are rigid downwards, and there's an increase in the price of energy, it's going to cause an overall increase in the price level. If energy prices go up, other prices don't change, it means an increase in overall prices. And we can calculate the answer to the what if question. What if energy prices go up and no other prices change? What would that do to inflation? And in fact, the mechanics are very similar to those ones we just looked at. Again, talking about, say, crude oil prices, if that's our basic input into this calculation, crude oil represents about half of the retail after-tax cost, or including tax costs, of the refined product. So if those other costs are fixed, to a first approximation, when the price of oil goes up the price by 10%, the price of the refined product goes up by 5%. And that's actually pretty close to what we see in the data. So you take the dollar share of refined products, it's about 4%. Multiply, if the price of oil goes up 10%, multiply by 5%. And that says a very quick and dirty way to calculate the effect on inflation of, say, a 10% increase in the price of crude oil is to multiply that 10% by 0.02. And that's the effect on overall inflation. And recently, Fed Chair Powell mentioned a rule of thumb that he sometimes uses, that if price of oil goes up $10 a barrel, which is about 10%, headline inflation goes up by 0.2%, which is roughly the same calculation. So what I've done in this graph is just look at the US inflation rate year over year as measured by the CPI. That's plotted in black here. And I took the year over year change in the price of crude oil and multiplied by 0.02. And that's plotted in blue here. which is a quick and dirty answer to this question. If the price of oil went up by that amount and no other price changed, what would it mean for inflation? And you can see this was a significant contributor to inflation in the OPEC oil embargo and the Iranian Revolution. Each of those, we saw the surge in inflation. The surge was much bigger than just the pure change coming from energy, but maybe about 2% of that surge could be a little less, could be attributed to the oil directly. And actually, you got a kind of similar calculation for last year. This definitely was a factor in the increase in inflation. Here's another calculation, a little more satisfying way to do it. This comes from a recent talk by David Wilcox and David Reifschneider, where they just look at the CPI and the various components and ask this what if question. What if only that component of cost, consumer prices had changed and no other had changed? What would have been the measured inflation rate? The sum of all those, by definition, is the measured inflation rate. That's in black. And blue here is energy. And this shows is that in the initial surge in inflation, really the energy prices were a very big factor in that. Later on, other items have come to be significant. And now, so it definitely is a factor in inflation, but it's by no means big enough to account by itself for all that we've seen happen in terms of inflation. Now, economic theory says, well, there needs to be some other propagating mechanism. Maybe inflationary expectations. Maybe people see the price of gasoline going up. They say, oh, I think all prices are going up. I'm going to raise my price. And you get some multipliers through that. Or in terms of monetary policy, how does monetary policy respond to these changes? And here, this graph shows a couple of elements of that response of monetary policy. The top graph plots the real interest rate in the United States, the difference between the Fed funds rate, which the Federal Reserve controls, and the year-over-year inflation rate, which is what we're maybe interested in. And so a monetary policy rule like the Taylor rule would say when inflation goes up, you have to increase the nominal interest rate by even more than inflation went up. That is, you have to raise the real interest rate if you want to prevent that inflation from taking hold. So here's a plot of the real interest rate. And the point I want to emphasize, as many others have, is that in the 1970s, that real interest rate went negative. The Fed was not following the Taylor rule. Of course, this is one of the points Taylor made, says that's why inflation got out of hand there. And eventually then, when the US tried to bring inflation down, they raised the interest rate much higher than the inflation rate. So if you took the view that that was a factor contributing to the inflation taking hold more broadly in the 70s, and you said, well, what's the story here in the last couple of years? Extremely negative real interest rates. And so maybe monetary policy was a facilitating mechanism. And of course, Fed and other central banks are now trying to reverse that and raising rates very rapidly. Another variable we used to talk about quite a bit, not so much now, is the rate of growth of the money supply, M2. It has a very loose short-run connection to inflation, but it was definitely there in the 70s. Another thing economists at the time argued is, well, money growth was getting way out of control, and that was part of what made these price shocks from the oil events translate into overall inflation. Well, if you look at the recent data, you would have said, oh, this was a major source of concern recently. So I think you can make a case that up until last few months, monetary policy was allowing this inflation to become much more deeply rooted than just the simple mechanical effects the energy prices themselves. And this is related to that point we were making, though, about the production function kind of calculation. Maybe we were trying to use monetary stimulus in the 1970s to keep people employed. Didn't really work then. We've been using monetary stimulus over the last up until this year to try to keep the unemployment rate very low. It was successful in that, but at the cost of significant inflation. So maybe I can stop there. I did have some policy points, but I do want to get to some of the questions. And as Rebecca said, if you have questions, enter them in the Q&A, and we'll try to take a look at them. One question was is it possible to obtain a copy of the slides? The answer is yes. I'll post them myself, and I assume Rebecca will do so as well. And one of the attendees early on, and I apologize, I'm only just now getting an opportunity to read your interesting questions. One of the questions was, can we justify the current increases in oil prices by jump volatilities rather than fundamentals? And that's a very interesting question. And this came up historically in the 2008 price increase. People were saying, well, these prices aren't really justified by fundamentals. We certainly don't see this month's consumption or this month's production change by the magnitude that the price changes seem to warrant. But oil is a storable commodity. People aren't just looking at this month, they're looking at next month and the next year. And so the way markets work, and the way they should work, is when there is any change in the assessment of the future. For example, if any news comes up that causes you to change your assessment of how much GDP is going to grow in China over the next year, how much is oil consumption or copper consumption going to grow in China over the next year, any of that shows up immediately in the oil. Of course, the price of oil is changing, jumping every minute in response to that. Now, it jumps a lot, and that's related to this point I was making about elasticities. The elasticity of demand is very low, elasticity of supply are very low. And when the elasticity is so low, it means that even a small change in quantity, even if it's a modest change in oil consumption coming from China, translates into a big change in the oil price. Another question came up from Tim Fitzgerald, asking about trade balances. So this is another point some people have raised, that it's a different situation if you're a pure oil importer or a pure natural gas importer, as opposed to, say, the U.S. current situation where we're basically energy independent. In the case of an importer, you've got a terms of trade effect. And again, from a frictionless neoclassical kind of perspective, the country is poor because we're going to have to pay more for the stuff we import. And that's one mechanism that in some models makes a difference. Now, the mechanism that I was emphasizing is it's not that critical whether you're an importer or an exporter. And the point is, yes, we may be self-sufficient in oil, but we're also dependent on the auto industry. And if there's a change in the price of oil, which causes a change in automobile sales, those unemployed workers in the auto sector don't costlessly shift down to Texas to start producing more. Those factories in Detroit that were making cars are not running at full capacity. There's underutilized labor and capital. And that was what I was emphasizing. And in my view, that's the critical step, rather than the terms of trade story that a lot of people focus on. Now, furthermore, I talked about consumer sentiment. And so consumers get upset when they see themselves having to spend money on gasoline that they didn't have allocated in their budget. So, well, but the oil producers, the oil companies get a lot more profit. Aren't they happy? Don't they go out and spend it? Well, they might, but there's significant lag there. It's in terms of the old Keynesian story, the marginal propensity to consume of the oil producers is much lower than that of the oil consumers. So I think the trade issue has sometimes been overstated. And finally, there's a question from Jeremy Weber. Can you say more about the mechanics of how the elasticity of substitution affects the link between oil consumption and GDP link? Yeah, so I went through that kind of quickly. Maybe I can go back to where I made that production function. Yeah, so I was talking about two things using data from two sources. One was consumers, and we can talk about the elasticity of demand. Here I was talking about a general kind of production function, and there's an elasticity of substitution as represented by this parameter sigma. And you can ask if a firm, say, has this production function, how do they respond to a change in the price of energy? And that elasticity of substitution turns out to be the elasticity of demand for the product. And so consumers being relatively inelastic corresponds to the kind of expenditure calculations I showed you. If firms are relatively inelastic, so intuitively, if you just kind of need that energy to produce, you're going to have a big drop in production if you have to make do with less energy. What happens when sigma gets smaller here? You're going to go ahead and buy that energy kind of no matter what. And so that's the link. Let's see. Well, so we got a number of others. John Ballantyne asks about, what about the longer term investment lags in expenditure and development? And I think that's related to the question we were asking about terms of trade. Yes, eventually those oil producers are going to, recycle those dollars, if you will. And for that matter, even if the money goes to Saudi Arabia, they may ultimately increase their spending on US products. But that's farther down the line. That's maybe after the recession is over. Recession is a very short, abrupt disruption in spending. And that's what matters the most. So I don't have much time left. Let me just jump to Xiao Yi Mu, who's asking, do I think US oil production will recover to pre-COVID levels? Yes, I do. I think that's underway, and it might well happen by the end of the year. So there's a question about policy, which is a great question. In fact, I had some slides on that. If you download the slides later, you'll see some quick policy recommendations. The no-brainer is nuclear energy. That's surely something Europe has to be using more in the short run as well as the long run. And fracking is something that Europe has said, no, not for us. I think they might want to reconsider that. In the short run, you've got to reduce demand. And one lever you can push on is public consumption, the government sector consumption of energy. For example, lowering thermostats in public buildings. You might even go with a 4-day work week in government operations. I wouldn't recommend mandating a 4-day work week for private industry, because that can impose big costs that you're not anticipating. But depending on how things play out, how cold the winter is, it could be a real crunch for Germany this winter. And I think policymakers need to be looking very aggressively at options. I'm a little disappointed that the United States didn't respond earlier with trying to ramp up our infrastructure for getting the natural gas delivered to Europe. We knew the problem was coming this winter to see it. Well, so we promised an hour. There are a number of other interesting questions here, but let me end with that and turn it back over to Rebecca.
Sure. IAEE wishes to thank James Hamilton for an outstanding webinar. We'll be glad to post your slides on the website. This webinar will be available for download on IAEE's website. If you're not already a member, we welcome you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.